wonderful week 3 of Learning with Miss Jones. Such a beautiful day outside, and amidst all the bad news that we received on Friday about schools being closed down the rest of the year, I hope you can still find some encouragement along the way. I'm not sure what that looks like. I feel for you guys a lot. I can't imagine what you're possibly going through. But just know I'm here for you if there's anything I can ever do for you. So now let's focus on antibiotics. What are antibiotics? Antibiotics block processes in our bodies when dealing with prokaryotic cells. They do no harm to eukaryotic cells, which is great news for us. If you remember, we have prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. Prokaryotic cells are bacteria cells. And eukaryotic cells are what we have, such as plant cells and animal cells. We have animal cells. So most of the time, antibiotics like to target the cell walls of bacteria cells, and we don't have cell walls. So that means all of our cells stay very healthy. Luckily, most antibiotics are antibacterial, and when you get prescribed one, you're trying to fight off some sort of bacterial infection. You know those infections: strep throat, an ear infection, a staph infection, all sorts of things like that. And I'm sure you've been prescribed them very many times. That's my mom in the background.
I don't even know where the camera is.
It's right there. She still doesn't know that she's in the shot. You may not remember all the times that you have been prescribed antibiotics, but I'm sure as you were younger and you had those ear infections and you had strep throat and everything else, your doctor gave you an antibiotic of some capacity. Some of the most common antibiotics prescribed are called penicillin and amoxicillin. Let's talk a little bit more about penicillin. It was discovered in 1928 by a guy named Alexander Fleming. And in the 1930s, two guys, Howard Florey and Ernest Chain, said, you know what, let's test the effects of penicillin out. And so at Oxford, they conducted trials. A cool thing about antibiotics is the fact that they were discovered in saprotrophic fungi. Did you hear what they said about my buddy Mushroom? He's such a fun guy. So Florey and Chain developed a method to be able to grow the fungi, penicillium, into petri dishes and liquid cultures. And ultimately, they could use that penicillin to treat patients. They noticed that the penicillin was able to kill the bacteria that were growing in the agar plates, but now they have to see if it actually works on living organisms like animals and humans. So they first tested it on mice. These poor mice. 8 of them were deliberately infected with streptococcus bacteria that was known to cause pneumonia and also death. 4 of these infected mice were given penicillin to treat the infection. The other 4 did not receive the penicillin. Within 24 hours, all the ones that were given the staphylococcus and were not treated with penicillin ultimately died. And the ones who were given penicillin survived. Yay! So of course, the next step, human patients. But here was the problem. They needed much larger quantities than what they were able to produce at the time. So once they thought they had enough, they decided to go on with the human trials. And that's when they found the perfect patient. He was a 43-year-old police officer who had an acute but life-threatening bacterial infection. The infection was caused when he scratched his face on a thorn from a rose bush. A thorn from a rose bush? Can you imagine if that was the case today? So he was given penicillin for 4 days and his condition improved greatly. But then they ran out. He suffered a tragic relapse and died. So back to the drawing board it was. Larger quantities were produced, and along came 5 more patients with acute bacterial infections that they could be treated for. They treated all 5 patients, and all were cured of their infections. However, 1 did die from other complications. But the bacterial infection was gone in all of the patients. That was their simple trial for penicillin. That was all pharmaceutical companies needed to hear, that penicillin was working. So in the United States, they started making large quantities of penicillin. It was confirmed that penicillin could treat many bacterial infections that were previously known to be incurable. It's highly effective. And we still use it today, but I will caution you on this later. Now, we've talked a little bit about this before, about drug testing and how the ethics go behind it, like Edward Jenner and his smallpox. That really wouldn't be possible today. And keep in mind, the study was done in the 1930s, so that really wasn't that long ago compared to Jenner in the 1800s. But there is a typical order as to which drugs are going to be tested nowadays. There's a chain of command they have to follow. Initially, these tests are performed on animals, then on a small number of healthy humans who sign themselves up to do so. If it passes, it is tested on humans who actually have the disease that the drug is trying to treat. And the last test is done on a very large number of patients to determine if there's any side effects that go along with it, if it's actually going to improve the condition, all sorts of things they look at to see what's going on. But haven't you heard those commercials where the side effects are pretty severe? I mean, we're talking about blood clots, seizures, heart attack, stroke, all things that could be life-threatening. In the 1950s, there's a drug called thalidomide. and it was used to treat mild conditions. They soon figured out it was also good to treat pregnant patients for morning sickness, so they often prescribed it to those pregnant patients. The side effects on unborn babies had not been tested yet, so unfortunately more than 10,000 children were born with birth defects and abnormalities before they realized it was tied to thalidomide. So tying this all back to penicillin, you have to understand that the patients that they tested it on were all patients that were on their deathbeds, even though they were just suffering through acute infections. The testing took place at a very rapid pace, but there was a greater risk-taking back then. Because of that risk-taking, penicillin could be introduced a whole lot faster than it would be in today's time. For example, on D-Day back in June of 1944, a lot of people got hurt. A lot of those soldiers didn't die because of bacterial infections, thanks to penicillin. Now, tying back in viruses to antibiotics, here's the thing about them. Antibiotics cannot kill viruses. Viruses are non-living, therefore they cannot reproduce and survive without a host cell, which means that they are constantly invading our cells, our eukaryotic cells. And if you remember, antibiotics only work against prokaryotic cells. Virus processes cannot be targeted by drugs because those drugs would attack our host cells and make us a lot weaker than we should be. And unfortunately, this has become a common problem. People are constantly going to the doctor and getting prescribed antibiotics for viruses. And it's causing antibiotic resistance. More on that later. Now luckily there are a couple of antivirals that we are allowed to take. A few viral enzymes have been identified for a drug to target virus processes without harming the host cell. But that's why only a few drugs have actually ever been invented to help against viruses. There's just not much out there to go off of. Thank God for Tamiflu. Without that against the flu, things would be a lot worse. And to tie all of this back to the COVID-19 outbreak, we don't have a drug that's going to ease these symptoms. We don't have a drug that's going to destroy the virus. And on top of that, even when we do develop a drug to treat COVID-19, can you imagine how long the testing phases will have to go through? And that's why they said that we need a vaccine. But here's the thing, even with a vaccine, we're not going to know those side effects for a long time. But our economy's tanking and people are going crazy. So it becomes a very complex situation that's going to take more time. And we don't have that much time to waste. At some point, we've got to get on with our lives. Maybe this is where we see an exception take place. And maybe it will happen a lot faster than we think. Here's a quote by England's Chief Medical Officer Sally Davies back in 2013, which says, "Danger posed by growing resistance to antibiotics should be ranked along with terrorism on a list of threats to the nation. If we don't take action, then we may all be back in an almost 19th century environment where infections kill us as a result of routine operations. We won't be able to do a lot of our cancer treatments or organ transplants." What she's trying to say here is that if we continue to misuse antibiotics, eventually they're no longer going to work. And if that becomes the case, these acute infections could kill us. This only becomes a huge concern if a strain of bacteria develops multiple resistance. An example of that is MRSA, and MRSA unfortunately resists all commonly used antibiotics. It has infected blood or surgical wounds of hospital patients, so you see this a lot in hospitals. Another example is multi-drug resistant tuberculosis. The WHO reported more than 300,000 cases worldwide last year, so it's still a problem. Antibiotic resistance can be an avoidable problem if we take the following precautions. We should only be getting antibiotics for serious infections, not for the minor ones. Complete your entire course of antibiotics once you get it. If you don't, you're at risk for those bacteria becoming even more resistant over time. So when you see it again, it's going to be a problem. Hospital staffs maintaining a high standard of hygiene. Farmers not using antibiotics and animal feeds for growth. And last but not least, pharmaceutical companies that are developing new antibiotics. No new types have been introduced since the 1980s. That's a problem. That concludes virtual learning of week 3 with Ms. Jones. I hope you enjoyed your lesson. I'll be posting a challenge for all of you guys, especially you seniors, on Google Classroom, so make sure you check there. If you guys have any questions, please let me know. Until then, I'm out. Good Trojans!